Hey everybody. So, oftentimes when I discuss the Faerunian pantheon, I'll have one of my students approach me after class and ask me a simple question. Who is the most powerful god in our universe? And truthfully, it's a valid question, because typically we hear about how our greater gods are mostly on par with one another, at least when it comes to raw power. Now, there is some nuance to that. They aren't completely comparable after all, so it's not totally cut and dry. But it really does beg the question. And truthfully, students, there is an objective answer to that very astute question. Because, believe it or not, every god in these realms answers to somebody, someone that most of you might not even be familiar with. Not a king, not fate, and not the weave, but a being so distant, so absolute, that even the gods think twice before crossing them. He doesn't grant spells, demand worship, or intervene lightly. Yet when the gods overstep their bounds, it's Ao who decides the consequences. So today's entry is about the Overgod Lord Ao, the creator of the universe in which we all reside. I suppose we should start at the very beginning, right? At the dawn of time as we know it. You may have heard extravagant creation stories in your travels, but the truth is, there are no detailed accounts showing how or even if Ao created the universe. Any specifics you may have heard over the years are likely just bards telling tall tales to keep you engaged. They're fun stories, sure, but there's very little truth to them. However, it is true that Lord Ao is generally credited for the deed. And in some traditions, Ao just created the sphere that covers our realm space, and then passed it off to the newborn deities to actually create the worlds and stars within. However, in other accounts, you'll hear that Ao directly created everything in existence, including the sphere, the heavenly bodies, and even the astral sea, using the raw energy of space itself. It's possible we may, one day, find out the specifics, but I don't think I'll be holding my breath. What we do know is that Lord Ao himself claimed to be the creator of all the gods, but he never specified whether or not he created the realms himself. Now, that's not to say Ao couldn't have done it, however, because theoretically, Ao can do just about anything he wants, more or less. But moving forward, do you remember how in a previous entry we talked about the separation of Abeir Toril and the Tablets of Fate? If not, then maybe I'll go over a little refresher. Long, long ago, our world existed as a compound world. Abeir Toril is one of the many worlds that appeared after Ao created the universe. This world was geographically very different from the world as we know it today. At the time, the world was devoid of life, until the primordials began to show up, elemental beings of chaos and entropy. But unbeknownst to them, the first gods were beginning to show up as well, with the first of them being Selune and Shar. When the twin goddesses became aware of the threat the primordials posed to order, they rallied the gods to defend the newly born world. This conflict would later be named the Dawn War, and while the gods and primordials clashed, life began to flourish on Abeir Toril. And at this time it was dominated by aberrations from the far realm, such as the Aboleths, and the creator races like the Batrachi among a few others. But to make a long story a bit shorter, it was towards the end of the Days of Thunder that a conflict kicked off between the Titans and the Batrachi. The Batrachi would summon even more primordials into the fray, which naturally brought the gods back into the battle as well. This war would rage on until one of the primordials, Asgaroth the World Shaper, said, "If he can't rule the world, then no one can," and hurled an ice moon onto the surface of Abeir Toril in an event known as the Tearfall. And I'm just now realizing I should make an entry on Asgaroth too, but I'll save that for another time. Either way, this is where our subject comes back into the fold. It was the Tearfall that finally spurred Ao into action. But what did Ao do? Well, He would quite literally take Abeir Toril and separate them into two entirely separate worlds, Abeir and Toril. Abeir would be given to the primordials, and Toril would be given to the gods. And to uphold this, Lord Ao would create an immensely powerful artifact known as the Tablets of Fate. And these tablets, which came in the form of stone slabs, served to maintain the balance between law and chaos. But they would also act as a barrier between the two worlds, such that if they were ever destroyed, the two worlds would slowly merge back together, which might be a bit of foreshadowing. So yeah, that's the power of an overgod. Ao could, on a whim, take a currently existing planet and split it into two entirely separate worlds. And this was, as far as I'm aware, the very first time Ao took direct action regarding the politics and conflicts in Realmspace. Generally an aloof and hands-off entity, Ao exists beyond the concepts of good and evil. Truthfully, he embodies all the aspects of both. He's easily more powerful than all the gods and primordials in the universe combined. He has no problem permanently damaging other deities, demoting them, or even creating new gods from existing sentient beings. In addition to this, unlike the gods he created, Lord Ao does not require the worship of mortals, nor does he desire it. Normal deities absolutely do require it, however. In fact, a standard god will literally wither away and die if they don't have any followers actively praying to them. Interestingly enough, this worship stipulation was actually instituted by Ao himself after the time of troubles. The idea was if a god requires worshippers to live, then they're more inclined to maintain the balance, because if they don't, there's a chance they'll be left with no one to follow them. But what's the balance? Well, the balance, as I understand it, is the philosophical concept that states that it is a universal necessity for the forces of good and evil, or law and chaos, to be balanced. This is so that no one side can gain a complete upper hand over the other. This doesn't mean that the good guys will never win, nor does it mean that bad things will never happen to good people. It's more about the overall balance. Bad and good things can still happen to individuals, or even whole cities, as long as broadly it all evens out. For example, many of the druids I've met on Faerun are committed to maintaining true neutrality in all things. Balanced life, measured thinking, and not committing too strongly to one side or another. They're only mortals though, of course, so they mostly just maintain the balance as best they can. But when it comes to Ao, the cosmic balance is the primary concern. Anything that thoroughly upsets the balance is something that will likely come to his attention. So how exactly did Ao and the Tablets of Fate maintain the balance? Well, as mentioned before, the tablets serve two purposes: to maintain the separation of Abeir and Toril, and to uphold the balance. The tablets themselves looked innocuous enough to your average observer, but if you were to inspect them, you'd see the names of every single deity that existed under Ao and their portfolio. A god's portfolio is essentially which area of interest the god represents and has power over. For example, Lathander's portfolio is that of the dawn and renewal, while Asmodeus's portfolio is that of lies and indulgence. See what I mean? Portfolios can usually only be altered upon death, resurrection, or otherwise major disruption of the life of a deity, such as during the time of troubles, when gods walked the land in mortal form. So clearly these tablets are pretty important, but of course, that didn't stop the gods from attempting to mess with them. In fact, in the Year of Shadows 1358 DR, the gods Bane and Merkel stole the tablets from Ao and hid them away on Faerun. It's said that they mistakenly believed that a portion of Ao's power stemmed from the tablets themselves. This event would displease Ao, as you might expect. In fact, here's a quote from Lord Ao himself speaking on the balance and the tablets he created to maintain it. I created the gods to serve the balance, not to twist it to your own ends. But this point was lost on you. You saw the tablets as a set of rules by which to play juvenile games of prestige and pomp. Then, when the rules became inconvenient, you stole them. So, what did Ao do? Well, this is where we come to the aforementioned time of troubles, and this would be the second time Ao himself would intercede directly in the actions of his lessers. Before the Second Sundering, we had an event known as the Time of Troubles, and if you aren't familiar with the Second Sundering, we do have an entry on that very topic archived. You should seek it out once you're done here. It's a really good illustration of the sheer power that Ao holds, even over the other deities in the universe. So yeah, in 1358 DR, you had the gods Bane and Merkel, Bane being the god of oppression, terror, and hate, and Merkel being the god of the dead at the time. They managed to steal the tablets from Ao, and when Ao found out, he must have realized that there needed to be consequences for this. Because truthfully, Ao was and is a very hands-off god most of the time. So when he found out what had happened, Ao would summon each and every deity into his presence, bringing all the gods, good and evil, to him. Ao then demanded that the one who stole the tablets hand them over. It seems as though if they would have just come clean, there might have been a way to avoid what happened next. But as you might guess, gods aren't always known to be the most humble, rational beings, so no one came forward. And so, forcing Ao's hand, he cast down every single god from the heavens, taking their divine power in the process. Which is just incredible to think about. Just imagine the sheer power one must have to, on a whim, strip power from some of the single most powerful beings in the realms. Anyhow, after casting the gods down, Ao gave his reasoning, and the reason he did this is because he felt displeased that the gods were, essentially, treating the world as if it was there entirely for their amusement, rather than to serve the use they were created for. And honestly, in my opinion, stealing the tablets was simply spitting in the face of their creator. Because remember, Ao is ultimately only concerned with the balance, and if the gods weren't serving that purpose, then they needed to be taught a lesson. So, after being cast down, the gods walked the land in mortal form for many years. They would wander Faerun in avatar form, and the broader effect of this action was staggering. First, divine magic ceased to function altogether, unless the cleric was within a short distance of the god's avatar. Secondly, arcane magic as we know it was completely unregulated. We've gone over the weave in previous entries, but the weave is looked after by Mystra, at least currently, and when she was cast down, there was no one maintaining any semblance of balance in the weave either. This caused it to become dangerously unpredictable. And thirdly, and most importantly in my opinion, was the fact that the gods were vulnerable. They walked Faerun and could be damaged, assaulted, and yes, even killed. All of this was done essentially with a mere thought. Hopefully you're starting to see why I chose to make this entry about Ao. So anyways, this carried on for many, many years. Several gods even lost their divine lives while they were in mortal form. But eventually, some intrepid heroes managed to retrieve these tablets and return them to Ao, only to be shocked when Ao himself destroyed them and ground them into dust, because though the tablets had been returned, Ao had been convinced that the gods were ultimately indifferent to their original duties. This act would cause the laws of Realmspace to begin to unravel, and thus started the era of Upheaval. So, once again, at the snap of a finger, Ao destroyed the tablets, set the gods back to square one, and since the tablets were also keeping the two worlds separate, they slowly began to merge back together. And mimicking the cosmic chaos, the political landscape of the world became tumultuous as well. with the return of Netheril and the last Rage of Dragons happening during this time. But this era might require an entry unto its own. In the end, after Ao witnessed the era of upheaval and the warring of the gods on Faerun, he would call a stop to all of it, and by his hand he would initiate the Second Sundering, as a way to restore the two worlds and bring back some form of order. And again, I do have an entry on this very topic archived here somewhere, but the ultimate outcome to the Second Sundering was the reforging of the Tablets of Fate and the reinstitution of the gods' portfolios, serving a new and inclusive divine reality. And I think this is where I'll stop this one. I think I've made my case fairly well, and even though Ao is pretty vague for you and I, he certainly has played a massive role in the evolution of our world. I think you can see the sheer amount of power and control this one entity holds over the entire pantheon. It's hardly an inconvenience for him to strip a greater god of their power and cast them to the ground as though they are a first-day adventurer. Now, there are some claims I've heard from colleagues that say Ao's power couldn't possibly reach to other realities. I suppose that makes sense, but I'm not sure we'll ever know the truth, unless you guys know how I might find my way into one of these other universes. In fact, I might start looking into that. Regardless, that's it for today, students. I'll see you for the next entry. Just remember, he may be quiet, but Lord Ao is always watching. And if a god ever claims absolute power, just remember, even they have to answer to someone. And that's it for today, folks. As always, thank you so kindly for reaching the end of this video. And if you learned anything interesting today, hit that like and subscribe button. Also, leave me a comment down below if there are any topics you'd like to see covered on this channel. Most of these topics are just things that I'm personally curious about, but feel free to put forward any suggestions. I'll see you guys next time, so be safe, take care, and happy trails.